The issues that matter to you most. Tonight, after 2 years of lockdowns, restrictions and isolation orders, the government says it's time to live with rather than fight against the COVID-19 virus. But can life ever really be the same again? I'm Trevor Phillips, and this is The Great Debate. Each week, we get to the heart of the issue dominating the headlines. Tonight, as the Queen is treated for COVID-19 and the government announces self-isolation rules and free testing are coming to an end, our viewers panel from across the country will tell their stories. They'll have their say, and they'll hold our studio guests to account. Joining us this week, Professor Azra Ghani, Chair in Infectious Disease Epidemiology at Imperial College London. The chef and restaurateur, Aldo Zilli. Harriet Minter, journalist and author specialising in women's rights and the future of work. And Lord Sumption, former Justice of the Supreme Court. The question facing us all tonight, are you ready to live with COVID?
It is time that we got our confidence back. We don't need laws to compel people to be considerate to others. I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
It is so important that people stay at home.
I'm not allowed to sit down anywhere.
No. Hello.
It's the first time Lorraine's seen her mum this year. A change in the rules means the limit on visitor numbers will be lifted.
Live from Windsor with breaking news as the Queen tests positive for COVID-19.
The word COVID sets a bit of a shudder. She is only suffering mild cold-like symptoms.
I am quietly confident. I think this is the beginning of the end.
I'm terrified, to be honest. The risk of COVID hasn't changed. You know, it's still a threat to my life.
We'll now be able to begin a new chapter, learning to live with COVID.
After two of the darkest, grimmest years in our peacetime history, I do believe this is a moment of pride for our nation.
Let's start, as always, with our viewers panel. I'd like to talk to Imogen Dempsey. Imogen, you're in London.
Hi.
Good evening. What do you think?
I'm very worried as to why the government is ignoring the science. British Medical Association and NHS leaders and the World Health Organization have all said it's too soon to be lifting restrictions. The removal of free testing is levelling down on public health. This is a really, really concerning measure. There are 3.7 million vulnerable people. There's a lot of us and a lot of friends and family. Scrapping the free testing and doing that is just absolutely appalling. It leaves us even more vulnerable.
And when you say vulnerable, Imogen, in your case, what does that mean? What level of risk do you think you face?
In terms of my vulnerability, unfortunately, I've got no antibodies from my first 2 doses of vaccine. I'm not sure about following the booster, but that was over 10 weeks ago, so that will be waning. We are talking here about lives and livelihoods for vulnerable people, because many vulnerable people are being asked to return to workplaces where there's now no protections in place, and somebody who is positive will be permitted under these new rules to go in. And if you've got vulnerable kids, they will be in classrooms with positive people and potentially bringing it home. That's obviously, you know, a hugely increased risk for everybody, and particularly for vulnerable people.
Imogen, thank you. Let's talk to Paul Johnston. Paul, you're in Stafford, I believe.
That's right.
How do you respond to what you've heard from the Prime Minister today?
I think it's fantastic news. I think we're at a tipping point where, as the lady just said, 85% have had both doses, 91% have had one dose. I think 66% of the population have been boosted. So we now need to move on and push this great country on.
Azra Ghani, what do you think? There clearly are two ways of looking at this. Where do you stand?
Well, I mean, it's very challenging, and there isn't a single science that we can follow. We're all learning as scientists as well as the wider health community. But there are basic premises in public health, and the first is that prevention is always better than cure. So anything we can do to protect people, to prevent them getting infected in the first place is valuable, and in the longer term is also cost effective. So I do feel very strongly that testing is an integral part of that, both allowing individuals to know their status and make appropriate decisions themselves, but also as a community and as a population as a whole, that testing system is really fundamental to surveillance, to us knowing when the new variants emerge and being able to assess as rapidly as possible if they are of concern.
All right, I'm going to come back to you in a second. Let me just go back to our panel, because I think Phil Eagle, Phil, you're in Derbyshire, you've got a question for our panel.
Thanks, Trevor. Yeah. We've spent the past 2 years being told that all the decisions are being made by following the science. I'd just like to know what science we're following now to lift the restrictions so quickly.
And your question, Phil, panel, if we've been following the science for 2 years, what science are we following now that restrictions are being lifted?
Back again. I mean, again, it's very challenging to pinpoint one bit of science. What we're learning all the time is how good the vaccines are. They're really central to us controlling this disease and moving on with our lives. And we do have the new therapeutics. However, I think most scientists strongly believe in testing and strongly believe in the principle of allowing people who have symptoms or test positive to self-isolate if they can. Now, of course, people can take their own responsibility for that, but that's not always possible. If individuals have to go to work and don't feel they can make that decision themselves, then I think we lose some of the public health response that's so critical.
So you would still be leading towards sustaining free testing, incentives to more testing than where the Prime Minister set out today?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, as the UK is probably the world leading in terms of the testing that's available and in terms of the surveillance. So people are following our science to see what's happening with the new variants, understand them. So this testing system is really critical.
Lord Sumption, do you agree? Azra Ghani says protect.
I think that that's an important factor, but it isn't the only one. I think the problem about this whole argument about following the science is that it is not just a scientific issue. It is an economic issue, it's a social issue, it's an educational issue, it's a moral issue, and it's always a matter for political judgment what weight you give to each of those factors. It would be quite wrong for the government to be guided only by the science. There have been periods in the last 2 years when they have been, periods when they haven't. It is about time that we looked at this very complicated problem in the round instead of just the scientific aspect of it.
But what about Azra Ghani's basic point that before you get to any judgment, precautionary principle, if I remember it from my laboratory days?
Well,
First thing is...
I'm not a fan of the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle is essentially a principle for taking action when you don't have the evidence to justify it, but think you might have later. Now, that's fine for some interventions, but if you are going to have an intervention which causes great damage or costs a great deal of money, then it seems to me that it can never be good enough simply to say, we don't know the answer, and therefore we're going to act as if we did.
All right, I'm going to come back to you in a moment, but let's go back to our viewers panel, and let's talk to Jan Boyd.
I personally am at a bit of a crisis point. I'm still wearing a mask when I go out. My social life has been very curbed, and I'm just concerned about this Freedom Day and let's get back to normal. And I feel like sometimes we're on an edge and we're going to fall off, and I'm not quite certain what the long-term ramifications of that are going to be. OK, Jan. Harriet Minter, you have some vulnerability to COVID yourself. What do you think?
So I really empathise, actually, with what Jan's saying there, because I feel that sort of double bind as well, this desire to have a life as we remember it, this desire to be out and to be meeting people and have a social life, and also this desire to take a level of personal responsibility, to say, actually, I don't want to pass something on to my parents. I don't want to pass it on to somebody else who's clinically extremely vulnerable. And as someone who does have a health condition which makes me more vulnerable to COVID, I am concerned that perhaps other people are not going to take those precautions. That perhaps people will say, well, I used to be able to get a test for free, but now I can't. And doesn't that mean it's all fine? Doesn't that mean it's gone away? And I think what's worrying in the messaging we're seeing at the moment is this idea of Freedom Day, as though actually taking care of each other for the past 2 years, being responsible for each other for the past 2 years was a bad thing, as opposed to something we should really be trying to do as a society. What's that thing they say where you measure the quality of a society by the care it takes of its most vulnerable? That's what we should be thinking about.
The Prime Minister says we should trust people now.
I mean, we should, but then we looked at our Prime Minister who went wandering around, hospitals, shaking hands with everybody, paying no attention to the science and taking no cautions whatsoever. So I'm not sure he is the best example here.
Aldo Zilli, we could pay attention to the needs of the vulnerable and so on, but you run businesses. There's a price.
Listen, whatever, the Prime Minister is the Prime Minister. We should listen to the Prime Minister, shouldn't we? He's in charge of the country and he hasn't done a terrible job so far. And today he's lifted everything completely. So we're going to be free again. And if you ask me, I don't think it's quite right that he's going to take away the taste and trace thing. But as a country, we need the economy to go back up again, as the hospitality industry has been on its knees for the last 2 years. We need people to go out to work, and by them going out to work, they'll come to our restaurants. And, it's something that I champion, unfortunately.
It's a judgment, but you say, in a sense, we've got to open up. All right, let's come back to...
reopen the economy.
OK, let's come back to our viewers' panel, go to the wall. Aisha Hennessy, what's your view?
Well, personally, I work with a very vulnerable section of society that are addicted to illicit substances and alcohol. And from what I've seen over the last 2 years, it's had a detrimental effect on their mental health. And I do believe, a lot of these people haven't got even, electronic devices to reach out to people. They haven't got family, they haven't got friends, they haven't got a lot of connections. And it's definitely had a detrimental effect on their mental health, their well-being, developing symptoms like anxiety. We've also had people that are quite isolated and had to work from home over the last 2 years who have developed addictions. People that we don't usually see coming through the door, who have now got, alcohol problems, substance use problems, over-the-counter medication issues. So I think, it's had a real effect on society, that piece of society that usually wouldn't be affected in this way, or wouldn't have these issues.
Aisha, that's very, very helpful. Thank you. Stay there. Azra Ghani, you rightly set this out as it's a difficult judgment, and you lean towards, as I said, the precautionary principle, but you hear from Aldo Zilli, the impact on the economy. You hear from Aisha Hennessy, the impact on mental health, that there are costs both ways. Can you see that the costs of not opening up might be greater?
I would first say what we're talking about here is not whether we're opening up the economy again. What testing does is allows people to make those decisions, to test before they go to the restaurant, to test if they feel concerned about their health, and then to go to the workplace feeling more comfortable and more confident that they are indeed safe. So I don't think that's the balance here. I suspect most of this is really related to the economic cost of testing. But I would remind everyone that the cost of testing depends on the level of transmission. If we have transmission at a much lower level, the cost will come down. There'll be fewer cases to test.
OK, well, let's see how this discussion has shaped the view of our wall, of our viewers' panel. I'm going to put everybody a question to you, and I want some hands up. One of the government's main announcements today was an end to the requirement to self-isolate if you test positive for COVID. So, what do you think? Should people still have to stay at home if they have coronavirus? Raise your hand if you think people should still have to self-isolate if they have coronavirus. OK, Joe, hold your hands. Let's see. Yeah, actually, just a bit more than half we're think that self-isolation should stay. Lord Sumption.
Well, the way you put the question, I think, somewhat invited that answer.
That's a lawyer's response, but anyway, they know what I mean.
OK, I'm sure they do. I think that there's one aspect of this which no one's mentioned so far, which is that we are not in the same situation that we were a year ago or a year and a half ago. The levels of vaccination are extremely high. Omicron is much more infectious than previous variants, but it is now absolutely clear that the symptoms are much milder. The proportion of confirmed cases that get hospitalised is less than 2% at the moment. The treatments available are much better. This is not as serious a problem as it previously was, and we're entitled to take a different balance of risks now than we would have been half a year ago.
All right, we are going to continue with the great debate. Up next, will living with COVID help or hinder the pressures on the NHS?
Hospitals in Lincolnshire have declared a critical incident because so many people are off work after testing positive.
We simply don't have the capacity in the NHS that we need.
You can just get one qualified nurse sometimes on the ward. It's absolutely ridiculous.
Started naming storms in 2015. We've never had 3 in a week. Last Monday, we named 2 on the same day. We've never done that before either. So, yes, it's been a very, very active week of weather, and we're seeing further impacts from these storms this morning. Storm Franklin, the latest one to hit, of course, and really strong gusts overnight, particularly Northern Ireland and northwest England, areas that weren't as badly affected by Storm Eunice on Friday. So each storm is different. Each of these 3 storms has affected different parts of the UK in different ways, but each of them providing some pretty serious issues as they've moved across the country. I think the winds were forecast pretty much were as expected. So the winds that we were predicting came to fruition. That's what we saw. And I think one of the things that meant that we didn't have as much disruption, perhaps, was because we named it on Monday and then we gave people 4 days notice. So spreading the word about this storm that was incoming actually helped people prepare for it. So train companies were able to adjust their timetables in accordance, and the energy companies were able to make preparations ahead as well. So that's part of it. I think we were able to name the storm, give 4 days notice, and that really helped mitigate the situations. But the winds were pretty much as expected. And structures get weakened by each of these storms that move across, of course. So because these warnings are impact-based, it's always hard to say exactly what impacts we're going to see from any individual storm. But of course, as Storm Dudley moves through, that does weaken structures that then could get broken or damaged by Storm Eunice. And then the third one coming in now, Storm Franklin hitting, bringing again very strong winds, and those winds are likely then to cause more damage because Storm Eunice has been through as well. So yes, this succession of storms likely to increase the problems, and of course they all bring more rain with them as well, and that's what we've seen now with Storm Franklin, that although rain and flooding wasn't such an issue with Eunice or Dudley, it is now becoming more of an issue as well.
love my job because I get to do something that is contributing to a better future.
This is the great debate. Are you ready to live with COVID? All areas of life have been affected by the pandemic, but probably none more so than the health service. Waiting lists are at record highs, staff are under huge pressures, and many treatments have been delayed. Let's hear first-hand experience from one of our viewers' panel. Mandy Wren, you're in Fareham.
Yeah.
Can you talk to us about what you've experienced in the last 18 months, 2 years?
Yeah, so in March 2020, just ahead of the first lockdown, my Hodgkin's lymphoma cancer relapsed in a very serious and aggressive way. And I think at the time it was clear that the strain of the NHS meant that cancer treatment was going to have to be prioritised towards those people that were going to benefit from the treatment. So it was very, very frightening for myself and my family. But luckily, I went forward with my treatment, which worked. A friend of mine at the same time, he was told that if he hadn't have had his treatment, life-saving treatment a week before lockdown, he would have not had it and he would have died. So this is still really serious stuff. And I'm really worried that continuing strain on the NHS will mean that there's still ongoing prioritisation. And I'm not just singling out cancer. I'm talking about the millions and millions of extremely vulnerable people. And if we don't have testing, if we don't monitor this disease, if people think that it's like a cold and they're just wandering around and they don't think that they need to self-isolate, then people like myself and the lady earlier on, we're probably going to have to be prioritised. And that's what I'm really worried about.
Hold on there for a moment, Mandy. I want to ask Rachel D'Ambrosio about her experience.
Yeah, so my story is that in September 2020, I went to A&E. I was in extreme abdominal pain. I was literally crying in pain. And they totally misdiagnosed me. And I ended up, when I came out, I knew that I just had to get seen somewhere. So I ended up going private. And 2 days later, I had a private ultrasound and saw a private consultant and was told that I had severe endometriosis and I needed a total urgent hysterectomy and that the endometriosis was literally strangling my bowels. And I ended up having a private laparoscopy because of the waits on the NHS to actually get a laparoscopy. And if I hadn't have done that, I totally believe that if I hadn't have lost my life, I probably would have lost my bowels. What concerns me about about what happened to me is that, is this the way is the government actually trying to force us into a two-tier health system where if you can afford to go private, you have to go private, and if you can't, you have to stick with the NHS?
I see you've got a question for our studio panel here, Rachel. Yeah, which is about the NHS.
It is, yes. So my question is, how much stress will living with COVID actually put on the hospitals and the NHS? Because it's already under stress at the moment. So it's just going to put it under more stress, in my opinion.
Thank you, Rachel. And thank you, Mandy. Rachel, question for our panel. How much stress will living with COVID put on our hospitals and NHS? And Lord Sumption, I guess the underlying question is that, can it cope?
Well, the very low proportion of confirmed cases that are now being hospitalised certainly suggests that it can cope. This is a much milder variant. But I think we've also got to bear in mind that the problems about particularly cancer, but also other illnesses, have arisen partly from the demands on hospitals from COVID itself, and partly have been the effect of some of the more extreme measures, particularly lockdown. A very significant increase in cancer deaths is likely to have resulted from the number of untreated or undiagnosed cancers, particularly at the earlier stage of the pandemic. Other diseases, like dementia, for example, which is traditionally been much the largest killer in the United Kingdom, have gone through the roof as a result of the countermeasures taken to control the pandemic. So, I mean, this is actually not a simple one-way option. It's undoubtedly right that the more beds are taken up by COVID patients, the fewer beds are available for other people. But damaging consequences have also been produced by the government's countermeasures.
All right, let's... I mean, we could no doubt spend the whole evening arguing about statistics, but I think your point is broadly made. I'm going to come back to Azra Ghani in a second, but Mandy, what do you think about Lord Sumption's view that actually the countermeasures to COVID may have been a contributor to the sort of problem that you outlined?
Oh, I don't necessarily disagree with him, but what I'm worried about is that as we sort of move forward with this view that we are now free, that the pandemic is over. It is not over. It is not over. This is going to continue, and hard choices are going to have to be made by people. And I'm going to stare everybody in the eye and go, this could be me. I could be dead in a year because there's not enough capacity in the NHS. And you've all seen me on this panel. Sorry to be provocative, but that's how I feel. So there's no point shaking your head and going, that's not true. It is true.
Azra Ghani, you worry about the numbers. You're an epidemiologist. What do you make of this?
No, I think their points are very valid. And of course, as we've heard, there was an immense stress put on the NHS, and I think the NHS and all their staff have done an amazing and fantastic job in coping in really such exceptional circumstances, and they're to be commended for this. If we can keep COVID at a low level, then we won't have to worry about the impact that COVID is having on the NHS, because it won't be having that impact. But what we absolutely can't do is say, we have Omicron at the moment, it's all mild, it's all gone away. What we do know for certain is there will be another variant. It is likely to be a variant that has some degree of escape from the vaccines, otherwise it couldn't sustain itself. And we cannot be certain it is going to be as mild as Omicron. So therefore, surveillance and testing is central to us knowing that and preventing a build-up in the future of the pressures that the NHS has experienced so far. OK. Harriet Minter.
I actually, I felt quite emotional listening to the two women speak there, because I had a similar experience. I ended up in A&E in November 2020 and felt like I was being a bit ridiculous, felt that I was taking up NHS resources at a terrible time, and actually ended up probably kind of hours away from death, and survived because of the NHS, because I had access to it, because they are really the backbone of our society. And everything that we say about how we protect them feels incredibly important to me, because they protect us. And I think when we forget that, where we end up in is a situation where we were pre-COVID, where we take it for granted, where we chronically underfund it, and where we leave our NHS weakened so that when things like COVID do happen, it is a massive pressure on them, and it shouldn't be. And that's what we need to be thinking about right now. We need to be thinking about, as Azra says, how do we keep COVID levels low so that we don't add to that pressure? And how do we ensure that we are not in this situation again where our NHS is already straining at the seams before a crisis hits?
Let's come back to our wall, and I want to talk to Pastor Mick Fleming. Good evening, Pastor Mick. You deal with, I think, a lot of people who need these services. What do you reckon about the NHS capacity to cope?
Well, it's a real struggle. We're trying to get people out with the mental health. We can't get it. People are losing their lives because of it. I'm personally taking people up to hospital in the car. They can't get seen. You can't get online appointments. I've got people with gangrene in their legs and they can't get their legs dressed. I could go on and on and on. The lockdown restrictions have caused devastation. There's no doubt about that. But I think if you take testing away, then you take choice away. Because if you don't know you've got it, you're wandering around and you're not going to test yourself, you don't have a choice, do you? And it just seems ridiculous. It seems, from what I hear, it's just like some of these guys from the politicians, they're living in houses with no windows. They don't see what's going on outside. The consequences of what we're talking about is death. And in the poorer areas and the poorer parts of the country, death on a mass scale. I've never seen anything like it, what I'm witnessing now. It's horrendous. It's horrendous.
All right, thank you, Mick Fleming. Aldo Zilli, I guess if a government minister were here, he or she would say, we're increasing taxes, putting 1.25% on national insurance. We're going to raise 12 billion a year, and it is going into the NHS to help solve these problems. Is that enough?
Well, I suppose it is, but increasing taxes and increasing national insurance like it's going to be, and obviously interest rates are going to go up. The standard of living is going to be more expensive. You know, we're going to have to pay more for everything. The Brexit as well hasn't helped at all. We've had 2 years. I'm talking about my industry. We've had 2 years of closure and opening, closing, and nobody's fault. You know, I mean, there was a pandemic, but I think now is the time for everyone to get positive. There's a lot of mental health problems in my industry as well, with chefs and waiters and people that haven't been able to work, or they had 2 jobs, or they had no jobs.
Thank you very much. Coming up, what will living with COVID look like for children and young people? That's next.
When the pandemic struck, young people saw huge disruption.
Enayat is from London and was due to sit his A-levels.
This is the first bit of sunshine I've experienced in a few weeks.
I want him to go back to school because I don't want to do homeschool.
I don't think that they should be going back. I'd rather homeschool him.
We don't really know what's going on with our lives.
Welcome back to The Great Debate, where this week we're asking, are you ready to live with COVID? Let's go back to our viewers panel and talk to Helen Pryor.
We've talked a lot so far about vulnerable people and how there's vulnerable people in society. Well, both my children are classed as clinically vulnerable from the start of the pandemic because they have a medical condition called PANDAS, which is an autoimmune condition. And I'd just like to highlight to everybody that COVID is not the only virus that we live with. There are hundreds of diseases, many of which are highly contagious. And it's nice to know if somebody's contagious in a classroom, but unless we're going to start testing for cold, flu, tonsillitis, scarlet fever, chickenpox, it's pointless testing for COVID because actually, if you've got a vulnerable child, they are vulnerable, medically vulnerable to lots of conditions. And unfortunately, what we've found is lockdowns, bubble closures, isolating teachers and classmates. It's actually impacted my children more than the virus.
Helen, Helen, I'm guessing that is indeed one of your children sitting with you.
It is. This is Evie, yes. Yes.
Evie, how's it felt to you?
Missing school through lockdowns has been a main issue for me. When I started to get better, lockdown just hit, and then anxiety impacted me going back to school. And then when I got back to school, things would be unsure and classmates and teachers would be off. So that impacted me a lot more than the virus itself.
Thank you so much, both of you. Let's talk to a teacher, Tariq Ali.
Good evening. Good evening.
Good evening. There's a suggestion there that actually what we've had to do to tackle COVID has had at least as big an effect on children as COVID itself.
It's been absolutely horrendous for teachers and especially for the pupils. For about 2 years now, the teachers have been absolutely instrumental in supporting all vulnerable pupils and their families through online learning. It's not just been the pupils, we've been supporting family members as well. Teachers have had to learn how to do this without any notice, without any training. We were sent home on a Friday. From Monday, you're going to be online. Many pupils had no access to computers at home, and they've missed about 2 years worth of their vital education. I would say that teachers have been unsung heroes throughout the pandemic, but my question to the panel is it now time to prioritize children and young people after 2 years of looking after other groups?
Thank you so much, Tariq. Tariq's question for you and I guess the rest of the country is it time now to prioritise children and young people after 2 years of looking after other groups? Aldo.
Well, yes, I totally agree with that. I've got a 13-year-old and a 16-year-old, 2 teenagers, and a 39-year-old. Obviously, I started young. But my 16-year-old and my 13-year-old, when the pandemic really hit us, I got them into work. I got them into work in the kitchen with me. We started doing deliveries together. We started cooking food for the neighborhood. We cooked food for the NHS together. So I could keep them busy because I could see that it was affecting them. I was more worried about their mental state because they couldn't go to school, they couldn't see their friends, and that affected them in a big way, especially my son. He's a footballer, and that had to stop. Sport, it's a big thing for him. My daughter, Twiggy, is 13, and she was very vulnerable, so I got them both busy.
OK, Harriet, you are closer... Well, you are a young person. Have you no sympathy for people of my vintage?
I have lots of sympathy. I'm thrilled you think I'm a young person, though. That's the highlight of my day. I think I have a lot of friends with young children, very young children, some of whom were born during lockdown. And certainly what they are worried about is the social skills those children are missing out on, the connections that they could be making, and the kind of very important learning that happens at a young age. And I I do think we need to be aware of that and aware of the impact it's having on those children. However, what I also hear them constantly complaining about is the second one child in the school, one child in the class gets COVID, a week later the entire class has COVID. It is incredibly contagious, we know that. And so while, yes, we need to be prioritising young people's lives and getting them back to living their lives, we also need to be aware of the fact that their lives are probably not going to look like ours did. And we need to help them understand that.
All right. Mohammed Walji, you have a thought on this point.
Yeah, hi. So I'm currently studying my A-levels, which I'll take in the summer. And I'm part of the first cohort to not sit any formal exams. Our GCSEs were cancelled 2 years ago. And we're going into the A-levels pretty much blind without having much prior knowledge. And there's so many questions that have been raised by the lifting of the lockdown today. For example, when we do go to do our exam, what if we have COVID? Will we have to isolate? And COVID isn't just affected our past, it's also affecting our future in that way.
Azra, you've probably had a lot of teenagers coming into your college in the last couple of years. What difference have you seen with them? And do you have sympathy with what Mohammed is saying?
Oh, absolutely. And I think we always have to prioritise the young people. It's been very challenging to do that so far in the pandemic, but I think at least over the last year, their lives have been prioritised. We certainly have the same issue with students. Everything in terms of the teaching had to go online very, very rapidly. And it's very difficult for young people to be working in that manner, not interacting with each other, not getting the experience that they would expect from education. So I think we do prioritise that. And actually, within our college, we keep testing in place to ensure that we can have a safe environment for in-face teaching.
All right. After the break, we'll be finding out what changes from the last 2 years our viewers and panel want to carry on, and what things they'll never do again.
It's so good to see Josiah having so much fun, wasn't it?
Yeah. I think people just needed that, to be able to hear somebody, know that they're not on their own.
People are at home, they want content, they need to stay fit and inspired.
In the midst of lockdown, it was a personal challenge that became a national triumph.
Big stories don't always come from big cities. I'm Lisa Dowd and I'm Sky's Midlands correspondent, and this is where I grew up. We can reveal that the driver who hit Harry Dunn is 42-year-old Anne Sakoulas.
Just met the president and we never thought we'd get this far.
This is what they're up against, that the wind is the really big problem. It is back-breaking work and the smoke is thick. It's been working well. Water levels are dropping, but no one knows what impact further rain will have. What would you do if this place wasn't open? We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world.
It's really scary. We're terrified.
In this community, I'm told that everybody knows someone affected by COVID.
Hopefully this will be the last wave.
I never knew they would make it. It's amazing.
Change seems tantalisingly close in this corner of the UK. Wales was the first to introduce the plastic bag charge. This is my patch, my specialism. It's also my home.
I'm Inzamam Rashid and I'm Sky's North of England correspondent.
we give a voice to communities often unheard and unserved from a region with a distinct history and global impact.
I love my job because I get to do something that is contributing to a better future.
Are you ready to live with COVID? That's a question facing our viewers, panel and studio guests tonight. From Zoom quizzes to clap for carers, working from home and banana bread, many things became synonymous with lockdowns and COVID restrictions. Now the government wants life to move on. Are there any positives from the last 2 years that our viewers panel want to take forward? Let's see what Ron Knox, an old friend of the show, Ron in Surrey, what do you want to keep?
There's something that I think sometimes we lose sight of over the last 2 years, which is how it's demonstrated the character and the values of the British people. It's become very evident. I mean, if you look at the army of volunteers that ensured a successful rollout of the vaccination, they are the real heroes of the vaccine rollout and nobody else. Same with the people who work in food banks and how much they've contributed towards making sure people don't stay hungry. Just wanted to say that also I've seen over the 2 years an increase in community spirit. In my own neighbourhood we decided to congregate every Sunday morning on the curbside outside my house and just, in a socially distant way, but just support each other and being able to share experiences of the week and feel that you're getting some some contact between other people.
Now we know if you want to be cheered up on a Sunday morning, we're all coming to your street. But I think the point about community spirit's an important one. Patrice Wellesley-Cole. Patrice, I think you have taken some positives from the last 18 months as well.
Yes, I have. Thank you, Trevor. Yes. Lockdown gave me the opportunity to hear from the best minds across the world via Zoom and Teams. I could attend meetings, I gave some lectures, and I also chaired meetings. And that was through organisations like BFWG, Women Graduates, Commonwealth Lawyers and Commonwealth Judges, and CVPP. I also became a Rotarian, and we had our meetings online. And as I live alone, being lonely, this did help.
Patricia, it sounds like you just had a terrific time in lockdown.
Well, Trevor, I made the best of it. I Zoomed with friends in different parts of the world, even went to Zoom parties. No, it was very stimulating intellectually because there's so many interesting lectures and talks online, as everything had to go online. And through my organisations, like British Federation of Women Graduates, Peace and Security, Commonwealth Lawyers and Judges, and UN organisations, it was very intellectually stimulating and a whole world was open to me.
Thank you. Let's talk to Hussein Coates. Hussein, what did it do for you?
Good evening, Trevor. It gave me perspective, fundamentally. It allowed me to realise that sometimes the small things are just as important as the big things. Particularly, relationships, a cup of tea, coffee, waving at the neighbour. All of that was really, really, really important to me. And I'll be honest, I lost perspective of that. So what's the one piece of advice you'd give to your pre-pandemic self?
Harriet Minter.
I think I would tell my pre-pandemic self, travel more. If she knew that she was going to be living in her very small flat continually for 2 years, I think she would want to get out and see the world. But also, I don't feel that I prioritised it enough before lockdown. And I personally am very much looking forward to being able to see more of the world now.
Aldo Zilli.
Spend more time with the family. My house was, pre-pandemic, was a hotel for me. I used to go there, sleep and go to work. Spending 3 hours, 4 hours a day just traveling. I discovered Zoom. And spending more time with my wife. My lovely Nikki now is a business partner from the pandemic that happened. And she started this business that is thriving and everyone's happy. I'm not traveling and they see me every day, so I can't wait to go back to work.
OK, so travel, don't travel, but going to business with your wife or partner. Jonathan Sumption.
Well, I shall want to do more of the things that I've been prevented from doing over the last 2 years. And in my case also, number one in that list will be travelling. I like travelling, and one of the big hardships, and one I think of the most unnecessary hardships, have been the border closures.
OK, so get an air ticket. Azra Ghani, what would you advise yourself?
Well, I'm probably also on the travel side of things, but working in this field, I think I would advise myself that it's going to be so much more difficult and go on so much longer than you can possibly expect.
John Hussaini Sesh, I'm going back to our viewers because we've got a moment here. And John, I think you had some thoughts about what you've learned.
Having the opportunity to work in a hybrid manner has been really beneficial. People have mentioned Zoom, Teams, which we had to learn to use. And working for a small health and safety business in Somerset, we've been sending out newsletters to help people understand what hybrid working could look like. Because for many of us, it's not just the able-bodied, but also, a hybrid working mode can help those that may be disabled, that may have had an accident, may have elderly relatives to look after. So, to be able to have that opportunity to work in a home-based situation, working smarter, not harder, not burning up miles on the motorway, stuck in queues, burning fuel. It has been a positive.
The hybrid working, this is your territory, Harriet.
It is. I mean, pre-pandemic, I spent about 15 years writing about the future of work, and a good 10 of those going into companies and telling them they could allow their employees to work from home and nothing bad would happen. And it took a pandemic to make them do it. But we've seen it now. We've seen it's possible, and we can't put the genie back in the bottle. So I think now is about companies understanding that actually if they are going to take hybrid working forward, if they are going to allow their employees to work from home, they need to work really, really hard to make sure they don't create a two-tier system where we favour people who are in the office over people who are at home, and where we ensure that we don't go back to a kind of all-hours culture, that we don't burn out. And if they can start to think about doing that, then what we're going to see with hybrid working is all of us being able to keep those things that we've loved about the pandemic. And that will be exciting.
Well, that's a good note to end our show on, because that's all we have time for this evening. It just remains for me to say thank you to our panellists here in the studio, Aldo Zilli, Harriet Minter, Jonathan Sumption and Azra Ghani. Of course, it's you at home who are at the centre of this conversation. And if you'd like to be part of the programme next time, get in touch. Email thegreatdebate@sky.uk. For now, I want to thank you all on the wall, on the viewers panel. Terrific as always. We'll see you in 7 days' time. And at home, keep talking. We'll see you again at the same time next week for The Great Debate.
ba ma dalee commencé liggéey bi yokkute bu bari am nañ ko ci